Welcome to episode 322 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Mark Sewell, who served in the FBI for 20 years. In this episode, Mark reviews his investigation of Mafia associate Steve Kaplan and Kaplan's operation of the Gold Club, the infamous Atlanta strip club that hosted some of the most recognized professional athletes and celebrities in America. The Gold Club was the largest single moneymaker for the Gambino Crime Family. Kaplan, mobster Mikey Scars, DiLeonardo, and 13 others were charged with racketeering, money laundering, and prostitution counts in an indictment that included criminal activity not just in Atlanta, but also in Miami and New York. Mark is the author of Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia. His personal account of what it was like to investigate this case and be prominently featured in the 2001 trial, covered daily by national media outlets. His true crime tale covers the twist that brought the 4-month trial to a shocking conclusion. Mark Sewell spent his career in the Atlanta division, initially assigned to an organized crime squad for 10 years before transferring to the Gainesville Resident Agency, where he worked on a Safe Streets task force for another 10 years. He was also a member of the SWAT team. In 2013, in the wake of the tragic school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut, Mark became one of the FBI's first certified active shooter event instructors, and for 5 years taught police response. Since his retirement, Mark has been working as a contract intel instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and operating I68.org, a consulting firm providing active shooter event consulting for churches and workplaces. Mark was previously a guest on episode 220 of FBI Retired Case File Review, where he reviewed his Stolen Valor military imposters case. After which he promised me to come back and review the Gold Club case. It was one of the cases that inspired me to write my first crime novel, Pay to Play, which is about corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. In the show notes for this episode, I'll include a link to my blog post, The FBI and Strip Clubs, where I write about how strip clubs can be magnets for criminal behavior and review other infamous FBI strip club investigations. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll also find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Plus, there's my FBI word search puzzle book, Fun for Armchair Detectives. Thank you so much for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Mark Sewell. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hello, Jerry. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, actually, this is your second time on the show. You were on episode 220 when we talked about stolen valor and military imposters.
Yes, that's still a great topic that I'm continuously working on as well.
Yeah, I know it was a popular episode, so I will make sure to put a link for that episode in the show notes for this episode in case anybody wants to go back and listen to that one too. Today, we are talking about a case that I have known about and been reading about for many, many years. And I explained that to you before, that my very first novel that I wrote is called Pay to Play. And it was actually inspired by a real case in Philadelphia about corruption in the strip club industry. So when I heard that you were one of the case agents on the Gold Club case in Atlanta, I was really excited because I had read up on that case in order to get inspired to write my first crime novel. So this is really exciting for me. And I've been waiting for this a long time because you've been working on a book.
Yes, I have. You're speaking of a long time. That was a long project as well, but now it's here. So that's exciting.
The name of your book is Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia.
Yes, it's a mob case. Here we are in 2024, and we don't hear about mob cases much anymore, specifically the traditional Italian LCN mob out of New York that was so popular when you and I were agents. But that's the nature of the case, and that's the nature of our call today is about the Mafia.
I know that this was a case that was in the news all the time during the trials. And I say trials because there were several of them. But there have been other books, there have been other podcast series about it. But this episode is all about you. And there was a line in the book early on where you were telling one of the witnesses about their story. If you know what I'm talking about, I'd love for you to recite that now.
Yeah, sure. I was a young agent when I got involved in this case right out of the academy, and I got assigned to this case. I was working with some very experienced agents, so here I am, the junior guy, bringing up the rear. I was sitting with the prosecutor, who was also very experienced. I had developed a witness, and the prosecutor was preparing that witness for, I believe at the time, it was probably a pretrial hearing for some suppression issues. And the witness, which was a young lady about 25 years old, was very intimidated by this attorney. She asked to the prosecutor, what if he's mean to me? What if he doesn't believe my testimony? What if, what if? These were all legitimate concerns on her part. And the prosecutor said to her simply, look, you were there. He wasn't. Just tell your story. That's what you're referring to, is that all of the books and the articles and the television programs that have been made about this case, none of those people were there, quite frankly. I was, and a handful of other people. And as I tell the reader in the book, this is my story.
It certainly is. Where do you want to start? Why don't you explain to everyone what the Gold Club was? Because it's my understanding that it was recognized within the strip club industry as the highest grossing strip club in America by far.
That is correct. The Gold Club in Atlanta, Georgia, was located in an area of downtown Atlanta called the Buckhead District. Buckhead is kind of the nightlife, bar, entertainment district for Atlanta. There's finance there as well, high-end shopping. It's just the go-to place. So that club being in that location was very convenient for everybody. That area, if you may remember also from the Ray Lewis Super Bowl shooting that happened back in the year 2000, that was in the Buckhead district. And of course, that was a large national case, Ray Lewis being the professional football player and Hall of Famer. All of that's in the downtown district called Buckhead. Our number one defendant in this case, Steve Kaplan, purchased the Gold Club in 1994, and he paid $3.5 million for it. By 1999, it was making $9 million a year. That's just in 99, not to include all the previous years. Good return on his money, to say the least. He purchased it before the 1996 Summer Olympics, which is important because Atlanta went through a metamorphosis in 1996. You could say that it was this mid-sized southern city, but after 1996 and the money that came into Atlanta for the build-out for the Olympics and all of the things involved with that, it turned Atlanta into one of the top 10 largest cities in America. It really became an overnight sensation. Industry just started booming. There's probably about 12 Fortune 500 companies that call Atlanta headquarters, such as Delta and UPS and Home Depot and so forth. To have this club in this area of Atlanta, Buckhead, in this city that is growing exponentially because of the Olympics, just set the club up to be incredibly successful. That's what you were referring to, is it was just in the right spot at the right time. $9 million a year, the number one grossing club in America.
Other than the location, what made it so special?
The club was actually very successful before Steve Kaplan purchased it. That's why he wanted to buy it to begin with and then just take it to greater heights. The club was special for a couple of reasons. Atlanta is infamous for its strip clubs. Georgia is one of 3 states that allows full nudity and full alcohol. That's a rarity. Those 3 states, Texas, Florida, and Georgia, have that law on the books that allows them to do that. And so the nightclub, strip club business as a whole booms. The Gold Club was the top of the heap because of marketing, in one. Steve Kaplan, the owner, was a fantastic marketer. And then 2, the location that I mentioned to you. 3, it just had this unique combination that it was not a club that was designed for any one type of customer. And here's what I mean for that. In the strip club business, to include in Atlanta, you generally have clubs based on race. You'll have a black strip club that caters to the black community and vice versa, a white strip club that is predominantly white. It's just the nature of the business. That business is naturally segregated. Not so with the Gold Club. It had a very eclectic group of characters to include the employees, to include the customers. Instead of just targeting the white community or the Hispanic community or the black community, the Gold Club targeted everybody, and it did it well, and it was successful. So now you have a larger population base to draw from. So all of these things that I just mentioned made it extremely successful.
And when you talk about successful, that also had to do with who they were able to get to come to the club.
Yeah. In the opening statements by one of the defense attorneys when we went to trial in 2001, he just broadcast, he said, the government's going to make issue of certain celebrities being at the club and participating in one of the charges, which was prostitution. And this defense attorney said, let me tell you who else was at the club. And he went through a list of the 2001 who's who of America. And because of that superstar clientele, it was a natural magnet for the average Joe. The average Atlanta resident wanted to go to the Gold Club so they could hang out with Dennis Rodman, so they could hang out with Andrew Jones, so they could hang out with any other athletic celebrity, or quite frankly, a Hollywood celebrity, whether it be George Clooney. The defense attorney even mentioned that name that's out there today, and that's Donald Trump, as being a guest at the club. Ironically, when he identified him to the jury by name, he said, the real estate developer. Who knew that 20 years later he would be involved in politics? That was the list of celebrities that was at the club, from athletics to real estate to Hollywood.
I guess the thing that we need to stress, and I'm going to let you just take off with this in just a minute, but the thing that we need to stress is that this was an organized crime, LCN, Italian Mafia case. But I think I can say that people keep forgetting that and really just think it's about the sensational stuff, the prostitution and all of that. But you got into this because you were on an organized crime squad. Why don't we get into the case, and why don't you tell us more about Steve Kaplan's association with organized crime figures in New York?
Certainly. When I first showed up in Atlanta in the fall of 1997, right out of the academy, I was assigned to the organized crime squad that was really just a brand new squad that had been created in Atlanta to tackle Asian organized crime, Russian organized crime, and now because of the booming strip clubs, we had knowledge that there was an LCN presence in Atlanta as well, in multiple clubs, not just the Gold Club. I showed up, I was assigned as a brand new agent to this 4-man team, me being one of the 4. My training agent, first of all, was John Simmons, who was an old New York organized crime agent back when Louis Free was on that squad in New York, and they had been squad mates. He had worked the Donnie Brasco case, for example, off of his squad. John Accavelli was also assigned to that squad, and he became my training agent in my second year, and he was a veteran of the C-16 Gambino squad in New York that had successfully prosecuted John Gotti Sr. In fact, when you had James Gagliano on some episodes ago, he talked about living with Sammy Gravano when Sammy Gravano became a government informant at the FBI Academy when he was put there for his own safety. Well, John Accavelli was the other agent that lived with James and Sammy Gravano at the same time. These 2 agents with all of this knowledge are there along with me, and Frank Graziano was our 4th partner. Frank was just a couple years ahead of me out of the academy, so we were kind of new to this game. But we had developed some information based on a tip from New York that one of their high-level associates had moved down to Atlanta and had purchased the Gold Club, Steve Kaplan being that top-level Gambino associate. Throughout the 80s and into the 90s, New York told us that Steve Kaplan had been in a couple different crews. Bobby Borriello, Anthony Moscuzio, both of those individuals as lieutenants and then capos had been killed during the 80s and the 90s when the Mafia wars were at their height. And then ultimately, Steve Kaplan was transferred to John Gotti Jr. into his crew. In the early 90s, John Gotti Sr. goes to prison for life. John Gotti Jr., his son, is made the acting boss of the family. And when that happened, our defendant, Steve Kaplan, was transferred out of John Gotti Jr.'s crew because a mob boss doesn't actually take care of associates. He was transferred to the crew of Michael DiLeonardo, who was an up-and-coming Gambino captain. In fact, he and John Gotti Jr. were in the same ceremony together when they were sworn into the Gambino family. DiLeonardo's street name was Mikey Scars. That's a great street name. It's very intimidating, obviously, Mikey Scars. It came innocently, though, from when he was a child. He had gotten a dog bite on the face and it left a scar on his cheek. He was thereafter always known as Mikey Scars. But Steve Kaplan, being this great earner, because he had numerous businesses throughout his adult life that were highly successful, and he was kicking up, as we say, to the Gambinos, he was assigned to these high-level Gambinos to be in their crew. You're not going to be in John Gotti Jr.'s crew unless you're a significant player, and then the same for Mikey Scars. One of the things that made Steve Kaplan so successful before he even got to the Gold Club was he had half a dozen stores that he had inherited from his father in Penn Station. Penn Station is underneath Madison Square Garden. It's where the Long Island Railroad comes in, and dozens of other train stations, switches, and there's about 500,000 customers that walked in front of his shops every day as they got off the trains and went through Manhattan. He kept those businesses and he moved down to South Florida and got into the nightclub business. He had clubs in Boca Raton and other places in South Florida. But those were legitimate, traditional nightclubs, dancing, disco, that type of thing. And then eventually in 1994, he bought the Gold Club in Atlanta, closed it, sold his Miami clubs, moved everything to Atlanta, still continued to operate his New York businesses in Penn Station. He was back and forth as an owner. He was in Atlanta probably 50% of the time. He was a very much hands-on hard worker, often described by witnesses as the hardest working guy in the building. And here he is, this fabulously wealthy, successful, multimillionaire guy that you would never know based on his work ethic and the way he carried himself. He lived in Oyster Bay in Long Island. One of his neighbors was Billy Joel, for example, in his community. A very wealthy individual, and the Gambinos loved him because of that.
Was the case already being worked when you were assigned to Atlanta and the organized crime squad, or was this something that developed that you were a part of from the very beginning?
It was opened before the Olympics, but because of the Olympics, which required a hands-on deck for every agent in the Atlanta office, the case went cold, like most other investigations in Atlanta. I showed up shortly after the Olympics. That's when the case was getting ramped back up, if you will. John Simmons, who was the original case agent, realized that he needed help on this case because it just had a lot of tentacles that he couldn't take care of them by himself. John Iacovelli had transferred to Atlanta and was on a different squad. He was recruited to come up to the OC squad because of his Gambino experience. Two new agents, relatively speaking, myself and Frank Graziano, were assigned to the case out of the academy. So now we had 4 people ready to kickstart this case that had been cold during the Olympics. That brings us to 1997.
At that time, were you given a specific part of the case to investigate? Did you have a certain role?
It would eventually evolve into that being a yes to your question. Not immediately. We didn't realize it until we got into it that we were going to have these geographical divisions that would need some help with. Eventually, the answer to your question became yes. I became the agent responsible for the crimes in Atlanta. John Iacovelli, having just transferred from New York, knowing everybody in New York, kind of became the go-to person for the crimes that Steve Kaplan committed in New York. And then John Simmons, who had also been in New York, but most recently had been in Miami, became the Miami agent. He still had the contacts down there because everywhere Steve Kaplan went, whether it was in New York or Miami or in Atlanta, he was involved in criminal activity. And under the RICO violation that we ended up charging him with, the FBI was allowed to go to Miami and pull those crimes out, go to New York and pull those crimes and make them part of the Atlanta case because it was part of the RICO conspiracy that was Steve Kaplan and the Gambinos.
Why don't you tell us what those crimes were, starting wherever you want, New York, Miami, Atlanta. What were the allegations of criminal activity that he was supposed to be involved in?
Atlanta, where I was the lead, most of the things were involved strictly with the strip club itself. What originally got people's attention was the credit card fraud. We started to receive complaints from customers that their credit cards were getting ripped, inflated, etc., and they weren't getting any satisfaction making their complaints back through the club. The club was stiff-arming them, claiming they were going to resolve the issues and never did. When I talk about credit card fraud, it's important to know that eventually we brought the IRS into this case because of the significance of the financial fraud that was going on in this case as well. And who better to handle that than the IRS? If my partner was here, I think he would tell you, my IRS partner would say that probably our most significant credit card fraud was somewhere in the $25,000 range for one individual for one night. But we had lots of $3,000 to $5,000 to $7,000 frauds that were occurring. Remember, this is 1997, 1998, 1999. Obviously, those dollars mean a lot more back then.
What do you get for $7,000 to $25,000 for one night at a strip club?
Well, anybody listening to this would probably say, well, the obvious answer is sex. But that would be the most expensive sex in America, right? The answer to your question is a complicated scheme that Steve Kaplan had developed. He sold the Gold Club. He sold the rooms. He sold the champagne. He sold the experience. He sold the dancers. He sold the time in the VIP room. He sold everything that he could. He sold jackets. He sold hats. You name it, he sold it. So if a customer rolled in and wanted to have a VIP experience instead of being on the floor on the first level with thousands of other people and wanted to be in a private room with a dancer or dancers, that room right there would cost him, depending on the size of the room, anywhere from $200 to $500 an hour. But you couldn't rent a room without buying champagne. And the Dom Perignon would go from $200 to $500 up to the Magnums, which were $800 a bottle. The girls charge just to sit on the sofa and chat with the fella $200 to $500 an hour, depending upon the girl and what she could get away with, what the customer was willing to pay for her time, if you will. And then with that came VIP memberships, where you would get a little bit of a discount if you paid a lot of money now. So the girls were encouraged to sell memberships. That could also include jackets, which were $200 jackets and so on. The club didn't operate exclusively on a cash system. As most people show up at a strip club, they don't have necessarily hundreds of dollars of loose cash in their wallet that they can tip the girls, the traditional stick money and the garter belt that goes around the thigh type of stereotype. So where are they going to get these hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in cash? The answer was the club sold what they call gold bucks, which was kind of a funny money, monopoly type of money, which is not uncommon in the strip club business, where I take my credit card and I buy $1,000 worth of the monopoly money. On top of that, Steve Kaplan would charge 20% to the customer just to make that transaction. Then he would also charge the girl 20% when she turned the money in at the end of the night to get it redeemed into U.S. currency. If you add all of these things up that I'm telling you about right now, maybe the customer walks out with a $5,000 tab. But what the girls would do if the customer was drunk, they would add some zeros, or they would inflate the number of champagne bottles that were bought, and etc. And maybe the customer wouldn't realize this because he was drunk, or he was just having such a good time he didn't pay close attention to his credit card tab. And then he would get home the next day, and maybe American Express would call him and say, are you aware that your credit card just got hit for $5,000 last night at an adult entertainment club in Atlanta? And that customer would say, well, I thought it was $1,000, not $5,000. And then that's where the debate would start. When these customers would go back to the club and challenge this, either in a telephone call to the management or a face-to-face with the management, the club would stiff arm them and say, well, let us do an investigation. The club was very good at basically never paying these customers back. When we ultimately settled this case, when the bad guys pled guilty in 2001, there was a significant amount, I think it was $250,000 that was set aside as part of the plea agreement just for credit card reimbursements to the community who wanted to come forward and make a claim that their credit cards had been taken advantage of. Credit card fraud was certainly going on in Atlanta. And then the other thing we were getting in Atlanta, a lot of noise about from our informants, was the prostitution with the celebrities. And then if there might be some police officers involved in protecting the club. So me in Atlanta, I was looking at credit card fraud along with the IRS. I was looking at the police corruption, and I was looking at the prostitution that was occurring. In Miami, it was mostly loan sharking, where Steve Kaplan was putting money on the street to loan to people and charging this crazy interest of like 25 to 50%, which is what happens commonly in the mob community. You borrow money and you got to pay twice back to make it clean. In New York, the same thing was happening. Steve had been loan sharking up there, but because he lived in New York and he had been involved in so many different things up there through his time with the Gambinos, there were other charges, from obstruction in a murder case to tax violations from skimming out of his New York businesses. And of course, we had skimming down in Atlanta. Remember that in 1999, a lot of clubs were still working with cash more so than they would today in 2024. So the Gold Club, of that $9 million that they were making every year and reporting that, maybe 20 to 30% of that was never reported because it was skimmed in cash and sent back up to New York and ultimately into the pockets of the Gambinos. Those tax violations are being investigated in Atlanta as well.
One thing that I remember from reading the book, which is excellent, it was a page turner. I just kept turning the pages and reading more and more and more. Why don't you talk a little bit about Steve Kaplan's time with the Gambino? Because it wasn't just something that started with the Gold Club. It had gone on for years, his association with him. Is that correct?
Yes, Steve Kaplan's relationship with the Gambinos started in the mid 1980s. Steve's first business was a roller rink, as harmless as that sounds. Then he moved into discos. And anytime you're a business owner in New York and you become successful, especially during this era of the 1980s and into the 90s, people are going to notice, and those people being mobsters. And it's basically who gets to you first, which family, which of the five families made a relationship with Steve first. And that relationship is kind of a quid pro quo relationship. I take care of you, you take care of me. I keep you from getting shook down by the other families or from other people that might want to take advantage of you. And in return, you get the physical protection from the Gambinos, but you're going to have to pay for that. Bobby Borriello, noteworthy, was one of his handlers. Bobby was killed in a rub out that happened in his driveway, and it was in retaliation because John Gotti Sr. had killed Paul Castellano to take control of the family. When John Gotti Sr. arranged the murder of Paul Castellano, he did it without the approval of the other bosses of the other four families, and that's violation of a cardinal rule. There was going to have to be payback for that. And that payback was that eventually, a few years later, Bobby Borriello was killed leaving his front door and trying to walk out the sidewalk and enter his car, and he was shot and killed there. At the time, Steve Kaplan was in his crew. Actually, if you want to go back one, Anthony Moscuzio was another made guy in the Gambino family that Steve Kaplan was assigned to, a.k.a. Shorty Moscuzio, because he was a short individual. He was real close with John Gotti Sr. He'd actually been his driver at one time. And on one occasion when John Gotti Sr. had been acquitted in one of the many trials that he was acquitted in before the FBI convicted him there in New York, as he exits the courtroom, walks down the stairs and goes outside to the waiting news media that's outside the courtroom, the first person to greet him is Anthony Moscuzio, who's his driver, and escort him into this Lincoln Town car to drive away. And that photo of Anthony reaching out and shaking his hand became famous and made its way around the United States. And that's who Steve Kaplan was assigned to during that time. Well, Moscuzio would end up being killed as well. Steve Kaplan's partner actually shot and killed him in the bottom of their nightclub in the late 80s. That was because what we believe that Moscuzio was just shaking them down for so much money that a personal beef developed between Steve Kaplan's partner and Anthony Moscuzio. And there was an altercation, and Steve Kaplan's partner shot and killed Moscuzio. It was ruled self-defense by NYPD. Ultimately, he walked on that at the time, but I'll jump forward a decade later. He disappeared. So the Gambinos got their restitution on Steve Kaplan's partner. Eventually, he made his way to John Gotti Jr. When you're in the crew of the mob boss's son, you know you've made it pretty high up the ranks, and that's where Steve Kaplan was. From there, he got transferred to Michael DiLeonardo. And as you know from the book, Michael DiLeonardo was probably what some people call the last real capo in the LCN, and probably would have been the boss of the Gambino family at some time soon if he had not been convicted. Not in our case, which I'll jump forward and say that he was acquitted, but 6 months later, New York indicted him on a couple of murders. He flipped and cooperated and went into WITSEC and became the most prolific turncoat in mob history, if you will. If you look at his lineage, Mikey Scars, Michael DiLeonardo, his grandfather had been a made man back in the day when Carlo Gambino was running the streets, what they called the Black Hand, the Italian Black Hand, before they had even developed into the five families that we know today. Mikey Scars grew up in the mob. His grandfather was a mobster who used to take him around to visit and socialize with other mobsters. I say that he was destined to be a mobster, and he was. He dressed the part. His brother had been a made guy in another family. I believe it was the Bonanos, and he had been killed in the mid-'80s in the Bonano War. So Mikey Scars went to the Gambinos. His brother went to the Bonanos. His grandfather had been a mobster. So he's this rising star in the Gambino family, destined to be the boss. Now Steve Kaplan's in his crew when we indict him in the Gold Club case.
All right. So if anybody has any questions, it's definitely an organized crime mob case that you're working in Atlanta.
That is correct. Down in the Deep South, who would have guessed that, right? For so long, we kind of had to convince people that we had Italian mafia in Atlanta. But you're right. To everybody that knew, it was the real thing.
I had mentioned that I had done a lot of research about the FBI and strip clubs because it is a theme. There have been at least 5 or 6 major cases that I'm aware of where the FBI was investigating crime in a strip club. And I actually wrote a post, which I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode, all about the FBI and strip clubs and the fact that strip clubs attract a criminal element.
Yes, without a doubt. We saw that in Atlanta, but you're right. Historically, whether it be Las Vegas, whether it be New York itself, most recently with the case at Scores Strip Club, which you had Jack Garcia on your show and talked about his relationship with people that were involved with Scores, Craig Carlino and other Gambino members, for example. And then down in Miami, those places have traditionally had strip clubs that were notably linked to the New York Mafia. And now we had that problem in Atlanta.
I would love for you to tell us more about your actual investigation, some of your witnesses, some of your subjects. Tell us more about the case.
It took us 2 years to develop a game plan on how we wanted to prosecute this case. But because of the size and the enormity, this club employed over 100 dancers, for example. Those dancers weren't all working each night, but it just had an enormous amount of employees. $9 million a year, hundreds of employees, thousands of customers, celebrities. So how do you tackle a case like that, and how do you take it to trial? Because you have to assume you're going to go to trial. You have to assume that Steve Kaplan is not going to plead this out, especially when he became represented by a particular attorney who was notorious for taking all of his cases to trial and seldom pleading. We just saw the handwriting on the wall that this was going to be a case at trial. So how should we investigate it and get it ready for trial? Through a series of using informants and other techniques, we eventually developed enough probable cause to execute search warrants. We executed 3 search warrants in March of 1999. One of the search warrants, of course, was at the club as it was closing at 4 a.m. The other search warrant was at Steve Kaplan's home in Atlanta. The third search warrant was his warehouse in New York in the Woodside area of Queens. That was his corporate warehouse where he kept his financial records from all of his businesses, to include the Gold Club. We executed those search warrants and they were very successful. We had individuals on scene that we encountered that gave us great incriminating statements. But more importantly, we confiscated and collected financial records and other types of notes among the managers, and what we call managers' notes among themselves, that were very incriminating. So now the FBI and the IRS had ideas of where the money was coming from, where it was going. We had handwritten notes about what the management was doing to promote these crimes and hide them as well, etc. So very incriminating information and very successful search warrants. And then the next phase of that was a long, exhaustive grand jury investigation. the mornings that we did the search warrant, half of the Atlanta office, which was about 100 FBI agents, were tasked with taking grand jury subpoenas and going out into Atlanta and finding all of the employees that I had given them addresses for that were both prior employees and present day employees, conducting an interview with those employees, assuming they would talk to the FBI as we stood on their doorstep, but more importantly, giving them a grand jury subpoena to come tell your story to the grand jury under oath. For 6 months, Jerry, from March of 99 to November of 99, we put over 100 people in the grand jury. It was an eclectic group of witnesses. As you can imagine, it was employees of the club. It was the traditional strippers, the barbacks, the bartenders, the doormen, people that ran the valets out in the parking lot. But we also put these credit card victims that had come forward and said that my card was taken advantage of. We had mobsters out of New York, John Accavelli and John Simmons had developed that had gone into witness protection or were working pleas in their own cases in New York that were willing to testify against Steve Kaplan. And then we had the athletes that were coming into the grand jury that we were getting their testimony on as well concerning prostitution. To answer your question, it was a 2-year investigation that led to search warrants. We executed 3 search warrants in March of 99, and then we had a 6-month grand jury to get ready to return the first grand jury indictment. That was in November of 99.
You guys are busy.
Yeah, it took the entire Atlanta office to either participate in the search warrants, because when we hit the club at 4 o'clock in the morning, Jerry, there were still probably 20 to 30 employees in the club, probably a dozen customers still in the club at 4 o'clock in the morning. Actually, we hit the club a little after closing hours, trying to get these people, allowing them to leave. I'm surveilling this in real time through the pole camera that we had on the front door of the club. And I'm calling out how many people are leaving, how many we still think are in the club, and et cetera. And then finally, we went ahead and executed. We encountered probably 20 to 30 people at 4:30 in the morning inside the club. There were people in Steve Kaplan's house sleeping that were encountered. At the New York warehouse up in Queens, we used the New York agents to assist us up there to confiscate those records and et cetera. We had a couple agents from Atlanta that went to New York, but most of the labor was done by New York agents. On that particular day in March of 99, there were probably 200 FBI agents that were involved in some form or fashion, helping in the next phase of taking down the Gold Club.
And from your book, I understand that the most incriminating information was from this warehouse in New York.
It was, Jerry. Steve Kaplan didn't throw anything away, to include all of his credit card receipts, the notes among the managers that were passed back and forth. One of the things that Steve Kaplan wanted to know is what was happening in his club on a daily basis. And he wasn't always there, or he wasn't there during the hours that it was open, or he was in New York. A technique was developed that at the end of each shift, each manager would write notes to Steve Kaplan and tell him what had happened during their shift. That would include everything from which customer complained about a credit card, which celebrity came in and received perhaps sexual services in which room in the Gold Club, which police officer came by. Police officers were sometimes comped and given gratuities inside the club. It was a list of things that happened that they thought that the owner of the club would want to know. And these had been documented in their own handwriting, dated, stored, and then collected historically up at the New York warehouse, along with everything that a waitress is writing down on her ticket to include the customer's name, a copy of the credit card transaction, what room they might have been in, what was the name of the dancer or the waitresses that waited on that customer. To have all of those names, to have all of those dollar figures, to have those dates corroborated everything that the customer was telling us when they were coming in to complain about their credit cards being taken advantage of. Now we did not have to just rely on a drunk customer who was unhappy that his credit card had been hit for $5,000 more than he suspected. Now we had these documents that supported his claim that he was there, that these were the dancers that took advantage of him. This was the manager that ultimately signed off on that credit card receipt and approved it. The club had developed a technique that they were encountering so many credit card complaints that they would have a manager come forward and review the tab before it could be closed out at the end of each night to try and add some authenticity to American Express and other credit card companies that they were doing their due diligence to prove that these charges were legit. But that too was a fraud and a farce because these managers could look into that room and see that this customer was literally passed out from being drunk, laying on the sofa asleep. And the girls would sign his name to these credit card tickets, or the girls would take his thumbprint, which became a requirement later by the credit card companies, and they would print his thumb and stick it on the credit card receipt, just like you and I would do if we were fingerprinting a criminal. They were fingerprinting these customers and doing it manually because the customer was drunk or couldn't do it himself, and et cetera. All of these techniques were put into place to show the credit card companies that they were doing their due diligence, but in reality, they had workarounds to get around it. It was all for the bottom line of just to increase the profits.
Which is like overkill because it was already a successful business, the most successful strip club in Atlanta and probably in America without all of that. What was it that made him condone this type of behavior?
Yeah, that was the $1,000,000 question that we all ask ourselves. Steve Kaplan was a multimillionaire many times over. If he had run the club 100% legit by following all the rules, he would have been fabulously successful. The only answer we can come up with, Jerry, is just greed. On the consensual tapes that we had where Steve Kaplan was caught talking to others about his business plan. For example, when he was in New York one time talking to the owners of Scores, he looked at their business plan, he looked at the way they ran their day-to-day operations. And one of the things he said was, you need to take all of these sofas and tables that you have on the bottom floor and get rid of them. They take up too much space. Don't have anything in there for the customers to sit on. Make them stand. And the reason you want to make them stand is so that you can pack more people into the club. That's how you make your money, not by making the club comfortable and a more of an experience. You just get as many people into that front door as you can and pack them in like sardines, and that's where you make your money. It was just all about, how can I make more money? How can I make more money? The answer to your question, it's just the age-old greed.
I know that this investigation was in the media all the time, and I'll have links to many of the news articles that were appearing around the country while this case was being investigated. The truth is that what the media was concentrating on was the prostitution with these NBA and NFL athletes that were coming into the club.
Yeah, that's correct. When we first executed the search warrant and the affidavit that Frank Graziano had written was unsealed, the media got a copy of it and they read it, and they would stand in front of the club while they were doing live TV newscasts. And they would talk about the mob and they would talk about the credit card victims. And that was the theme that was going out in the early days of this case. But then, as they read a little bit closer into the affidavit, they started to see where there were some prostitution allegations. They also started to read where we were protecting the names of certain customers by using their initials, but identifying them as a basketball player or something to that effect. That's where the focus became. Even though we tried to hide that, so to say, and not make it a part of the case that demanded attention, it ultimately ended up gathering all of the attention. The term that I use is the media hijacked the case. It became all about the celebrities and all about the sex, to the point where whether it was Jay Leno or David Letterman or Sports Illustrated or the New York Post or the Washington Post, you name it, Jim Rome on his sports show, every leading sports show, entertainment show at late night and et cetera was now telling jokes, talking about the athletes, talking about the girls, talking about this crazy confluence of New York mobsters, beautiful strippers, and famous celebrity athletes. And I agree, it is this crazy combination of these three. The focus eventually became all about the athletes and all about the prostitution. You're right.
Talk a little bit about the FBI and strip clubs and prostitution. The act of prostitution can be a federal offense classified as ITAR prostitution. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because even though that's not what the case was about, there were going to be charges that involved prostitution.
ITAR, the acronym that you mentioned earlier, was Interstate Transportation in Aid of Racketeering. simply being if you use an interstate instrument, such as a credit card, to engage in prostitution, it can be a federal offense. And technically, it is a federal offense because of the interstate nexus. It can also be a federal offense if the business itself, such as the Gold Club, is engaged in interstate commerce. And it is. All of the alcohol comes from out of state. The furniture to put inside the club comes from outer state. The FBI can show that this club is engaged through credit cards, through infrastructure in interstate commerce. So therefore, that's another way to prove that the prostitution has a federal nexus, if you will. Then under RICO, you can bring in certain state violations. While prostitution might have been a Georgia state violation of certain types, we were allowed at trial to tell the jury about those state violations, even if it hadn't met the threshold yet of a federal violation. Maybe the customer didn't use a credit card. Maybe the prostitution didn't happen at the Gold Club. Maybe the Gold Club arranged for it to happen off campus and it was the use of cash, but it's still a state violation. And the RICO allows you to introduce that evidence to the jury. So the jury still heard about these incidents. Of course, the media heard about them and reported as well. That's what the federal nexus is on prostitution. It's the use of an interstate facility, whether it be the club or the credit cards.
But again, the thing that I think that your book was really trying to get everybody to remember is that this was initially an organized crime investigation. That's the squad that you were on, and that is what everyone involved in this case were hoping that you would be successful in charging and proving those offenses. How long did it take between the search and when finally indictments came through? Because sometimes it can take a while and people are reading the newspaper waiting like, when's the indictment? When's that going to happen?
The first indictment, Jerry, took 6 months. The grand jury from March to November of 99. Then we had 2 superseding indictments in the following year, in the year 2000. We had one in March and then again in the summer. And it was the second superseding indictment that brought in Mikey Scars in the Scores extortion, where they were shaking down or helping participate in the shakedown of the New York strip club Scores. And that's where Mikey Scars, Michael DiLeonardo, became a defendant in the case. The third indictment added some more charges that we learned about as the investigation continued to go on, specifically against the police officers and specifically against the Delta Airline employees that was helping Steve Kaplan defraud Delta Airlines as well. But you're right, Jerry. We were not oblivious to the fact that we faced this burden of trying to run a mob case while everybody else wanted to run a celebrity prostitution case, or at least portray it as that. I've told people before, you remember in the 92 Olympics, for the first time, the U.S. basketball team fielded what was known as the Dream Team. It was Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and et cetera. Fast forward to the year 1996 to the year 2000. And with the celebrities that were involved in our case in Atlanta, you could have fielded another dream team, but not in just basketball, any professional sport that you want. We could have fielded an undefeated NFL team, an undefeated Major League Baseball team, and certainly basketball, because Steve Kaplan was a huge New York Knicks basketball fan. So his preference was to have basketball players in his club. That was very common, but it was also the who's who of every other professional sport as well. That was the burden that we faced, was running this OC case and presenting it to the jury as an organized crime case while everybody else wanted to present it as a prostitution case.
At the time of this indictment, how many people were indicted and who were they?
Yeah, 17 individuals total were indicted. Steve Kaplan and his management crew, which was about another dozen managers that helped him run the credit card scams, arrange the prostitution, were aware of the tax scam, etc. That was the core of the defendants. Everybody that testified in the grand jury, Jerry, a decision was made by the lead prosecutor, Art Leach, and rightfully so. We supported his decision, was to give them immunity in exchange for their testimony. All these girls and guys had to do, the athletes, the dancers, even the credit card victims, the mobsters, just come in and tell the truth based on what the evidence indicated was the truth. And they would not be prosecuted for their admissions of engaged in any criminal activity. They were going to get immunity for their grand jury testimony. That was the deal. There were employees of the club that were loyal to Steve Kaplan and came in and lied to the grand jury, and we knew they were lying. We had overwhelming evidence that they were engaged in either credit card fraud or prostitution. And yet they refused to come off of that admission. And so ultimately, there were two dancers that were charged in the indictment as well. Those being the two dancers primarily that Steve Kaplan used to arrange, not necessarily always participate, but to arrange sexual encounters that were basically like his managers within the dancers' ranks that could orchestrate and coordinate credit card fraud and just keep things humming among the dancer ranks. We also indicted two Delta Airlines employees that were involved in a ticket scam with Steve Kaplan as he traveled back and forth to New York and Miami. And we indicted two Atlanta police officers. By the time the indictments came out, one of the police officers had retired and he was indicted. And then the second one was still on active duty. And their charges ranged from obstruction in our investigations and in other law enforcement investigations to also just aiding and abetting some criminal activity. One of the officers was in the permits unit that is designed to regulate the strip clubs. And that officer was charged with calling the Gold Club in advance and tipping them off to inspections that his unit might be conducting on a certain night. We had multiple witnesses tell us about those tip-offs. That officer eventually also became involved in sexual activity as part of his payments at the club. And then we had a second police officer that was primarily charged for his obstruction in a rape investigation that happened actually in a club limousine. The defendant in that rape investigation was an employee of the club and was charged in our federal indictment as well on unrelated charges, unrelated from the rape. We had police officers, we had Delta Airlines employees, we had the dancers, and then we had the club management. Those were the eclectic group of the 17 that was charged in the indictment.
And of those individuals, how many of them were actually mob connected?
Steve Kaplan himself, the owner of the club, and the other one from the 17 was Michael DiLeonardo, the Gambino captain. If you look at it from a hierarchical perspective, you had Michael DiLeonardo, the Gambino captain at the top. You had Steve Kaplan, the owner of the Gold Club, second underneath him. And then the other 15 defendants were just supporting the Gold Club. It's this crazy, lucrative business that could make fabulous amounts of money that could be funneled into Steve Kaplan's pockets and into the Gambino's pockets. But as far as having a day-to-day, I can pick up the phone and call the mob, that was the top two individuals, Michael DiLeonardo and Steve Kaplan.
Let me ask you this question because, again, in your book, Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia, you talk about something that FBI agents mention all the time, and that's when you have a strong case with good evidence. We talk about the fact that if the defendants can't attack the investigation, they attack the investigator. And so in your book, you talk about many situations when it gets towards the trial and during the trial where you personally were attacked and allegations were brought forth that were unfavorable to you and, of course, to the prosecution. Let me ask this question. Is this one of the main motivators for you to write your book, to get this story straight?
It's not one of the main motivators. It's a pleasant side effect of the case. The main motivator in writing the book was everything that's out there in the media that's been created about this case either comes from the media's perspective or the defense's perspective. There's nothing out there other than the case itself, the transcripts and the historical evidence that's from the government's perspective. And so after 20 to almost 25 years now of seeing this one-sided slant of the depiction of this case, that was my main motivator. And of course, while I'm doing that, it gives me an opportunity to set the record straight on smaller details or the other things that were just not truthful that are being put out there by the defense. Those are pleasant side effects.
Well, I know one of the allegations was that you threw a videotape at one of the defense attorneys.
Right. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution led with a headline said, "Agent throws tape at attorney." That took on a legend of itself. I was in New York a year later and I was introduced to some agents up there. And those agents' response to me was, "Oh, we know who you are. You're the agent that threw the tape down in Atlanta. And anybody that can throw a tape at a mob attorney is all right by us." If they had known that what really happened there, in their mind's eye, they told me that I was on the witness stand and I just picked up a tape and threw it at the defense attorney. And that's not what happened. But in their mind's eye, and if you read that headline, agent throws tape, that's what you would think happened. It was just an unpleasant exchange between me and a defense attorney when nobody else was in the courtroom except a handful of other attorneys. And it just took on legend from itself.
Now, the other allegation was much, much more unpleasant, and that was that you had a sexual relationship or an affair with two of the dancers that were witnesses. I definitely know that you cleared that up, and the fact that you're still here talking to me and that you didn't lose your job is all the proof that we need to know that that did not occur, because that, of course, would be unacceptable for a bureau case agent. But let's talk a little bit about that. I want to clear that up because I know that there was another podcast series that I listened to about this case. They make the allegations in there and they add all of this quote unquote evidence that didn't exist.
You're right, Jerry. Go back to your earlier question about what was part of my motivation. It was just the slant that the defense was putting out there, not only about the allegations about myself, but just in general about the evidence, about the government, about our motivation. This was not a case about morality, as the defense liked to claim so often, and so on. But yeah, during that podcast that you're talking about, and every opportunity that they had, they were making insinuations about myself primarily and a couple of the witnesses. What we found early in the case, Jerry, is that we, being the government, we being the FBI, were having tremendous success flipping witnesses. But it's not because we were great at flipping witnesses. Quite frankly, the Gold Club had chewed these people up, spit them out, and now they had been abandoned and had this just terrible taste in their mouth for the relationships with these people, with the club in general, with the strip club industry. When we finally found these former employees, these former witnesses, these former girlfriends, all across America, from Miami to Las Vegas to New York to Houston, they all said, "Hey, I'll tell you everything you want to know. I hate these guys." The defense could not in their mind wrap their hands around how we were having such success by putting witnesses in the grand jury and then ultimately on the witness stand at trial that were proverbial killing them with their testimony of their firsthand knowledge of criminal activity, from meeting with mobsters to credit card fraud to paying police officers to prostitution. You name it. These female witnesses had all of this personal firsthand knowledge. The defense's rebuttal to that was there must be something going on. And who's handling these witnesses? And primarily it was me that was handling these Atlanta witnesses, or the crimes that were occurring in Atlanta. And so that's where the allegation went, is that you have a new agent who's 30 years old, and you have female employees who are approximately 25 to 30 years old. So there must be a romantic relationship there. A lot of these girls that were witnesses referred to me by my first name as Mark, not as Agent Sewell, which is a stereotype that television uses. When witnesses would refer to me by my first name, defense attorneys would just try and take advantage of that and insinuate that there must be more than a professional relationship there. And every attempt that was made at trial to introduce that type of evidence, at least formally through witness testimony, was denied by the judge. And the reason the judge denied that is because there was no foundation for it. The next alternative for the defense was to make insinuations, to make it during times where the jury was not in the jury box, but the media was in the gallery and the media would report it, or to make it a pretrial hearings or suppression hearings. One time, the defense attorney even made a reference that one of the witnesses had my last name, incorrectly spoke the witness's last name, instead called her Mrs. Sewell, which is my last name. And then when corrected, the defense attorney said publicly into the media, well, she might as well be Miss Sewell. So those were the type of innuendos that were always thrown out there that the media gladly reported on, to include from Greta Van Susteren at CNN to the local newspaper reporters here in Atlanta. And it just grew and had a life of its own.
Tell me how that affected you at home. because I would imagine that the anger that you felt must have spilled over into your personal life.
At the time, not so much. We were all so focused on the case, lots of support at home, and everybody understood the reality of the situation. Your insinuation there is accurate, but it's more after the fact. After everybody took a step back, the case is over. You look at what was said and you realize, wait a minute, this was really some low level, dirty pool, as John Machiavelli would say to me often. You didn't recognize it at the time to the extent that you recognize it after the fact. But to be fair, we knew that this was a possibility going into the trial, that some of these defense attorneys had this reputation for taking these desperate attempts to dirty up the FBI agents. So I was warned that this was a possibility, so we weren't completely blindsided by it. But to answer your question, it was more an after the fact than it was during the heat of the moment that we were all kind of taken back by it.
I'd love for you to address the quote unquote proof or evidence that was discussed in this podcast series, because you can come back very strong with your own proof that it was, as I like to say, a big fat lie. And that was about some alleged phone records. Let's get that straight, because I love the way that you're able to tear that apart, to break that down and destroy the allegation.
One of the defense attorneys in the podcast that you're referencing, it's 20 years later, and it's easy for the defense attorney, I guess, to claim that he made a mistake and his memory is just not as sharp as it might have been 20 years after the fact. But what he does in the podcast is he mentions some things that just absolutely did not happen, that were inaccurate. There's no historical evidence for any of that. And then also he confuses issues with dates and times and so forth, and it makes it sound like much more of a sordid affair than it is. Concerning the telephone records that you're mentioning, there was an allegation that I was conversing with one of the witnesses at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And that was proof that we had a relationship ongoing. The defense claims that they went and pulled the toll records for that witness and showed that we were having conversations at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And then the defense claims that when that witness took the witness stand, that female witness was confronted about those toll records at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. None of that happened, Jerry. If they ever had toll records, they were never introduced at trial. Whether they got the girl's toll records or not, I'm not aware of it. It was never introduced as a trial exhibit. It was never introduced at cross-examination of the witness. There's no historical data to back it up, whether it be testimony or physical toll records. Where they got this information from is only a guess. If I wanted to try and be fair, there were times where the witnesses would call me through the switchboard. As you well know, they didn't have my home number, so they couldn't call me at home. They would have had to call the FBI switchboard and then ask for the switchboard to switch their number over to my home number, and then my home number would ring and I would answer the phone.
Patch call.
A patch call, right, which would create a record at the switchboard in Atlanta that these phone calls had occurred. There were a handful of occasions where these female witnesses were being intimidated by the defense's attorneys and by private investigators that the defense had hired. Sometimes if an employee was out at midnight in Miami and was at a particular bar in Miami, and remember, this is an Atlanta case, all of a sudden, a defendant would show up at that bar for the logical no other reason than to try and intimidate that witness, because they knew that was a place where that witness hung out, or they had friends that said, yes, we understand they're going to be at this club tonight, and etc. That employee would then call the switchboard and say, what do I do? I'm here at this club and so defendant is here. Should I talk to them if they try and engage? Should I call 911? I'm actually scared. What should I do? And switchboard would perhaps call me on those one or two occasions and ask me for advice on what I should send back to that witness. The switchboard would never patch those calls through. And we would play on a couple of occasions that were documented, that were brought up at trial by us, the government, to show that these witnesses were being intimidated. We would show that there were late night calls, and that's how we learned about the intimidation. But as far as 4 a.m. calls to just talk about the case and, hey, I'm nervous about testifying, which is what the podcast infers, is completely 100% untrue.
Is there anything else that was out there in the media at the time or has come forth in recent books and podcast episodes that you also want to get straight? Because this is the opportunity.
Nothing comes to mind unless something from reading the book that I have forgotten. But what does come to mind in regards to your question is the fact that one of the defense attorneys was later indicted and charged with the underhanded obstruction techniques that they took place in Atlanta. It was a New York defense attorney who pled guilty to those charges, was disbarred. The fact that we were claiming these defense attorneys were using underhanded techniques, were engaging in their own version of witness intimidation and witness obstruction, ultimately proved true as this attorney being convicted of those charges.
I understand that this trial took place over 3 months, almost 4 months long. Every day you're working, doing witness preps and preparing yourself to take the stand. I think you took the stand 3 times?
That's right. Yes.
Before we drop the mic on the situation that ended the trial, is there anything else about the trial that you'd like to talk about?
Well, you're right. The trial was 4 months, and we were only on direct during those 4 months. We never rested, and the defense had not started their case yet either. So this trial may have been easy, a 6-month trial. The logistics to support a 6-month trial, you can imagine what that would have been like. But somewhere, and like you said, the mic drop, which we'll get to in a moment, probably the thing that's worth noting is the shuffling in of the witnesses and what it took to get them to the witness stand. Each witness was unique. What I mean by that is we had witnesses that were in the witness security program. We had witnesses that were in the FBI protection program. We had witnesses that had been relocated. We had witnesses that were just flat out scared and requested to have an escort from the parking lot up to the front door of the courthouse or even into the courtroom. And then we had the celebrity athletes. One of the things that we did, whether right or wrong, a deal that we struck with the celebrity athletes in an effort to gain their cooperation is that we simply told them that we will do everything we can to get them into the courtroom and get them out of the courtroom without having to bring them through the common areas where they would be mobbed by not only attorneys, but by reporters as well. They appreciated that, and that sometimes solidified our cooperation agreement. What we would do, Jerry, is I would drive down to the attorney's office and I'd pick up his client. He could be a 7-foot tall basketball player, smuggle them into the courtroom, so to say. And I would pick them up and drive them into the bowels of the courthouse down in what we call Marshall's lockup, as you know, where we bring prisoners to bring them into court. It's a basement area of a building that is restricted to government employees only. Then I would take a series of elevators with these athletes up to the courtroom floor, or maybe even the floor underneath the courtroom. And then we would take a series of fire escape stairs. And then we would take a series of doors that led to the judges' chambers or to court staff chambers or to a hallway that was outside the judge's courtroom that the media did not hang out in. We would time this so that these athletes would arrive and wait right outside of these side doors to the courtroom as the prosecutor was calling their name to take the witness stand. And then they would come in through the side door and not through the main door of the courtroom and then take the witness stand and testify. Then me and my partners would do this in reverse to get the witness off the stand and back down the stairs and down the elevators and into a car and then out of the building and et cetera. Comically, sometimes the media was literally chasing us down the hallway trying to get a quote from that athlete. But this is in response to your question about how difficult it was in a 4-month trial, whether it was witness protection or athletes or just scared witnesses. It was a shuttle service that we had to refine to get witnesses in and out of the courtroom and be able to accomplish our goals.
I'd like to stress how stressful being on trial is for everyone in the prosecution team. I'm sure the same thing for the defense team. It really takes over your life. I remember situations where I stayed up overnight with the prosecutor preparing for the case the next day, getting home just in enough time to get a few hours of sleep and change clothes and get back to the courtroom. This happened for you and the rest of the team for a 4-month period. This took over your lives, I take it.
It really did. Just imagine the agents, we got to switch in and out depending upon the witness. If it was an Atlanta witness, I was there in the courtroom at the prosecution table, working with the prosecutors to prepare their direct testimony and cross-examination. I was doing the prep the night before to get that witness ready with the prosecutor. But if it was a New York witness, then another agent took over. Our lead prosecutor, Art Leach, and his second chair, Glenn Baker, they didn't have anybody to help them out and switch out and so forth. They really carried for 4 months. They carried that load of every single night, late nights, weekends. We prep witnesses on the weekends, get there first thing in the morning and be ready. So imagine being a prosecutor with no breaks for 4 months as well. It was definitely a team effort, and you're right, it was exhausting.
But it appeared to be going quite well for the prosecution team. Of course, the defense had not put on their side, but what was happening as far as what was being presented was very successful. You were winning.
We felt like we were winning, and I think the defense felt like we were winning too, which led to what you mentioned as a mic drop, which ultimately led to a secretly negotiated plea agreement.
A secretly negotiated plea agreement. Now, you have to really explain to everyone how this is not normally how a plea in the middle of a trial, which doesn't happen very often, is negotiated. Usually, everybody on the prosecution team is aware of it and has an opportunity to provide input, but that did not happen in this case.
Yeah, in my career, Jerry, I probably had jury trial 10 or 12 times, and never did anybody plead guilty in the middle of a trial. They always took it to the very end. We're 4 months into this trial when we learned that there might be a plea agreement being discussed. The secret part of it works like this, Jerry. I had a witness on the stand. I walked him out, put him in his car, sent him home, told him to come back the next morning. I went and saw the prosecutor up in his office later that afternoon. He said, look, we're good. We don't need to prep. So just go on home and get some rest, and I'll see you first thing in the morning. They went home. We went home. We kind of looked at it as a win. We got out of there around 6 o'clock one night. I'm at home, maybe 7 or 8 o'clock that evening. The phone rings, and it's my supervisor who tells me that we're not going to have trial the next day, that there has been a plea agreement struck, and it's going to be walked over to the judge's chambers for his approval. The only thing we know is that as of right now, trial will not resume the next day. And of course, I knew nothing about this. My supervisor said, in fact, come on into the FBI office the next morning. I'll call everybody else. The whole prosecution team, minus the prosecutors, will be there. We'll sit around the table. We'll get the U.S. Attorney's Office on the phone, and we'll figure out what's going on. So the next morning, we meet in a squad conference room, and we talk to the section chief for the criminal division. He puts us on speakerphone. We put him on speakerphone, and he explains the following to us, that a couple weeks prior, one of the defense attorneys had reached out to the government through another prosecutor and said that we would like to negotiate a plea agreement, but we're not going to do it with the lead prosecutor, because the lead prosecutor was adamant about, hey, if we're pleading this out, you're going to have to plead to the charges that are in the indictment, especially now that we're 4 months into this. That request made its way up the food chain to the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, the number one prosecutor in the office. And he gave his approval for another prosecutor in the office to start holding negotiations. After each day's courtroom testimony was complete, one defense attorney representing all of the other defense attorneys would come and meet with one prosecutor secretly representing only the U.S. Attorney's Office and the U.S. Attorney, and would negotiate a plea. The prosecutor would take the results of that each day and run that results up to the U.S. Attorney, not down to us, not to the prosecutor, not to the agents, but up to the U.S. Attorney, and said, this is what they're offering and so forth. And that type of relationship was explained to us through this conference call that had been going on for the previous couple weeks, and that finally a deal had been struck that the government and the defense had agreed upon. Now we had to get the judge to agree upon it. So that was news to us.
And how did you feel about that? To me, that had to be demoralizing.
At first, we didn't know what the plea agreement was, Jerry. So, yeah, we're a little upset that we weren't cut in on it, right? Because that's just the right thing to do, is let the prosecution team, which is the line prosecutors, the agents that are investigating the case, let us know what's going on. Even if you don't want our opinion on what the plea should be, the correct thing to do would say, hey, this is happening, and we want you to know about it. We felt like it was just disrespectful not to tell us that it was happening. The plea agreement that was struck Different people had different feelings about it. Ultimately, it was a success for the government, a huge success, certainly a financial success for the government. Did everybody get the sentence that we all felt like was perhaps warranted? That can be debated, but at the end, the government won. Steve Kaplan went to prison. The Gold Club was forfeited to the government. Steve Kaplan admitted his guilt in a number of violations, and the financial loss at the time was the most significant financial loss, the largest dollar figure in an LCN mob case in FBI history up until that time.
And I congratulate you on that because it was a very successful case. And I know that there were additional charges a couple of years later. Talk to us about those.
One of those charges was what I referenced to you earlier. One of the defense attorneys that was from New York was caught in New York on tape doing the same things that he was doing down here in Atlanta, where he was ambushing witnesses. When I say ambushing, doing an interview, walking into their place of business without them being aware that he was coming, secretly wearing a tape recorder and asking them leading questions, knowing that most likely the witness is going to give I don't know answers or an answer that's not embarrassing to them because they're now in this public setting at work or maybe even at their home, recording these conversations so that the defense attorney could then use it as rebuttal when that witness took the stand. In other words, didn't you tell me on a certain date something contradictory to what you're now testifying to? As far as the rules and regulations of judicial protocol, that's just very underhanded. In some districts, it's even forbidden. When he was doing that, when that defense attorney was doing it in New York, he was caught on tape severely influencing a witness. He was confronted about it. He was actually even indicted and arrested, and he pled guilty to that. As part of that overall obstruction charge on this particular defense attorney, the New York agents came down to Atlanta and took the incidents where he was obstructing in our case and made it part of their case. Again, the beauty of RICO, where you can reach out to crimes in other cities and incorporate it into your case. So our case and our witnesses that had been intimidated kind of got a rebirth again a couple years later with this new defendant case in New York with this defense attorney that he pled guilty to. So you're right. Steve Kaplan himself was also charged in that indictment in New York, even though he was in prison at this time, because he was intimately involved in a number of these audio tape recordings to intimidate these witnesses. He was helping prepare people to wear tapes. He was giving them the questions to ask and so forth. He was intimately involved, and so New York charged him as well. However, the conditions of his universal plea down in Atlanta when he pled guilty to the Gold Club charges stipulated that he could not be charged on crimes that the government already knew about. We couldn't charge him on those in the future. We did know about these obstruction charges and these intimidation charges, but a decision had been made not to charge him in Atlanta on those, at least not at that time. So when New York took up those charges, they were unaware of the plea agreement details down in Atlanta. Ultimately, they had to dismiss their charges in New York against Steve Kaplan. But the defense attorney, that did not apply to him, and he pled guilty.
At the time that this plea deal was struck, two of the defendants decided they did not want to plea, and so they went on to trial. That result was more disappointing.
That's correct. We had one of the police officers and Michael DiLeonardo, the Gambino captain, went ahead and took their case to the jury. After the secret plea agreement was struck upon, the defendants came in and pled guilty. There was about a 2-week hiatus in the trial. And then after that 2 weeks, trial resumed, but now with only 2 defendants, not 17. One of them was the police officer that I mentioned earlier that had worked in permits. Even though we had half a dozen witnesses, for example, Jerry, that said they took phone calls from that police officer who told them that inspections were happening that night and he was tipping them off. Even though we had another half a dozen witnesses who said that that police officer engaged in sexual activity with club employees, the jury acquitted him. The Gambino captain, Michael DiLeonardo, we knew his case was the weakest. We always knew that. We had a mobster who had agreed to testify in the grand jury. He was a Gambino captain. He was in prison. And as part of his plea agreement, he had agreed to cooperate in other cases throughout the U.S. So we brought him down to Atlanta. He testified in the grand jury, and he strongly implicated Michael DiLeonardo in the Scores nightclub extortion. But when it came time to testify at trial, he took the witness stand and refused to testify. The judge ruled him in contempt and gave him, I believe it was an 18-month extended sentence on top of his already federal sentence. But that piece of evidence was crucial for the jury to hear. And when he refused to testify at trial, that damaged our opportunity to really convict Michael DiLeonardo, and the jury acquitted him. But as I mentioned to you earlier, 6 months later, New York picked him up, indicted him, charged him with 2 murders. He eventually pled guilty to those murders and cooperated and became a government witness for numerous trials, to include against John Gotti Jr. He testified 3 times in 3 separate trials that received hung juries. But in the course of his testimony, as you know, Jerry, sometimes he would have to reveal his prior criminal history to the jurors so that the defense couldn't get that out there in advance. He testified that he was guilty of the crimes in Atlanta. He testified that Steve Kaplan was the cash cow, and that was his term, that they used to just fatten their wallets in New York with the Gambino family. They wanted to make Steve Kaplan happy in Atlanta, so he would keep making them happy in New York. And this was all part of his testimony when he's testifying in these trials in New York years later. So it was vindication that we had the right guys, we had the right evidence, but we just couldn't get the jury in those 2 examples to convict.
At the end of all of this, were you and all the members of the prosecution team satisfied with the outcome?
Good question. I'm going to say no to that. You know, our prosecution team was 4 agents, 2 prosecutors, and 2 IRS agents. So you have 8 people that are heavily invested in this case. I doubt you're going to get 8 people to agree on what the appropriate punishment should be. The club was closed. The club was forfeited. Steve Kaplan's financial loss between forfeiture and fines was in the tune of about $10 million minimum. In that regard, we were in agreement. He only received an 18-month prison sentence. In that regard, people felt like obviously it should have been longer. And then lastly, the police officers, not the one that was acquitted, but the other police officer who was also indicted, was able to negotiate a sweetheart of a deal where all he had to do, Jerry, was forfeit his police certification for a period of 4 years, remove himself from police work for 4 years, and the government would dismiss the case against him. And to me, personally, that was the most outrageous thing in the entire trial. Now, maybe I was overly invested because he was my defendant. I had developed all of the evidence of his obstruction in a rape case, and I was heavily invested and convinced that he was guilty of those violations. So that's an example of me not being satisfied with the outcome of a particular defendant. But when you have 17 defendants and you have 8 agents working the case, it's hard to get agreement on everything.
Is there anything that is in the book that, of course, we want everyone to go out and get a copy of it? I really enjoyed reading it. I thought you covered all the aspects of the investigation and of the trial, and it's institutional knowledge of how you work a case like this. So I really encourage everyone to go out and get, again, Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia. Is there anything in there that, just in case someone doesn't go out to get a copy of the book, you want to make sure they know about this case before we finish this case review?
The last thing I'll say about that, it was a team effort, Jerry. We could not have gotten a conviction if the evidence had not been as strong as it was. The evidence would not have been as strong as it was if it wasn't for agents traveling to Miami, traveling to New York, traveling to Las Vegas, traveling to Houston. We found one witness, Jerry, working for NASA as a contractor in Houston. I went out there, located him. He was a gold mine of information. If we had not all done those legworks as a team effort, then we wouldn't have been able to force them into that negotiated plea that happened in month number 4. We just beat them down with witness after witness after witness. The question is, where did these witnesses come from? And the answer is the FBI, with help from the IRS, went out there and found these witnesses all across America. And we had really good prosecutors who knew how to present a case. So it is the classic example of a team effort that ultimately led to a conviction.
Well, I want to thank you for doing such a thorough review of this case. I want to remind everyone that you've also done a really great case review on episode 220, Stolen Valor, Military Imposters. During that conversation, I did ask you to tell us when and why you joined the FBI. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to give us a quick version of that again.
Jerry, I was a Marine officer in Hawaii, so I was living a pretty good life. I had a lot of job satisfaction. I love being a Marine, and who doesn't love living in Hawaii? But I decided that Marine life can be tough on a family, and if I was going to leave the Marine Corps, I was only going to leave it for one agency, and that was the FBI. So I applied to the FBI. I was accepted in 1997, went through new agents training. The answer to your question is I belong to the two greatest organizations that exist, and that is the Marine Corps and then the FBI as well. So I wouldn't have left one if it wasn't for the other.
You had a 20-year career with the FBI, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What are you doing now, other than writing best-selling books?
I'm still teaching for the FBI as a contractor up in the Quantico area. I teach curriculum up there to fairly young agents, and I'm enjoyed doing that. I've been doing it for 5 years now.
All right. And of course, at the end of every episode, I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, that's easy. I knew you were going to ask me that, and I just want to put it back on you and say thanks to you for this podcast and the service you do for the FBI. I think you've been recognized all the way up to the level of the director of the FBI, even having him on as a guest. You're taking all of these cases that we have historically worked and getting them out there to the civilian population, letting the agents tell their story, which so often is not the case, and you're to be commended for that. So thank you.
And that's the end of the interview. And your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Mark Sewell and Gold Club case-related images, plus lots of news articles about the case and trial. There is, of course, an image of the book cover for Mark's new book, Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia, and a link for where you can purchase the book. There are also links to other FBI retired case file review episodes featuring strip clubs and my blog posts, The FBI and Strip Clubs? I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.